bit you're in with the storm and everything coming in.
It didn't come anywhere near us.
Okay.
It's sort of the northwest coast, so as far away as you can get. I'm in Miami, so
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I barely know the geography of the state I live in, let alone Florida. So your house looks like it's in one piece. Hey, let me introduce you property here, since we've gone live. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And today my guest is Mark Rowlands, and Mark is a professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Cooper, sorry, I want to get this right. Mark is a professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Cooper Senior Scholar in Arts and Sciences at the University of Miami. He is the author of over 20 books, translated into as many languages. Mark is the author of a new book called The Happiness of Dogs: Why the Unexamined Life is Most Worth Living. It happens to be out in the UK right now. It's going to be published in the States in January under a different title, just to complicate and confuse, called The Word of Dog. But when it comes out in the States, we're going to revisit this book and talk about it and put it in our book club. So it's available to you here easily. And we'll talk about that title. And today, what Mark and I will talk about is the ideas in the book. And I have a bunch of quotes that I pulled out of the book that I'd like to share with you. So, first of all, Mark, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the book. I like it. It's a quirky, interesting read. I have an opening question for you just related to the writing of this. It seemed to me that given the fact that you teach philosophy at a university level, you'd be looking for ways to get students, whether graduate or postgraduate, interested in your work. And I think that maybe I'm wrong, but I hear echoes of things that might have been used in your classroom, in the sense that I think that in talking about your dogs and the meaning of life, you, ears would perk up. People might even look up from their laptops a little bit and pay attention, because that's an interesting way to do this. And I see the dog right there. Which dog is that, by the way, that I see here?
the shadow,
This is
the
Shadow, yeah. And I
main.
know your dogs pretty well because they feature heavily in the book. And my dog Zip, that spends his morning on my lap, is up now having his nap with Jeannie on her bed.
Yeah.
So his favorite thing is when I say, "Do you want to go see Mama?" He knows exactly what's going to happen. He runs up and sleeps under the eider down between her feet. So that's where he is.
Uh-huh.
Um, People that watch my stuff have seen Zip, because I occasionally post stuff about him. So let's talk about your book, and just what I asked you there. Have you been able to share some of this information about dogs and philosophy and the way you work it together with your students in class, or is this just in the book?
This is just in the book. I haven't inflicted it on any of my students yet.
Will you?
Um, Maybe we'll see. If I can think of ways of turning it into a philosophy course. So the course would presumably be on the meaning of life or something
Yeah.
like. Um, so yes, because there's a solution to the question of the meaning of life in a book, or a semi solution, if you like.
Yeah.
So yeah, incorporating other, other sort of classic texts on, yeah, there is a course there waiting to be put together, I
Good.
suspect.
Hey, let me read something from your book here. I think it's from early in the book, I think page 29. Um, and I'm quoting your book here, The Happiness of Dogs. Um, Meaning comes effortlessly to Shadow's life, Shadow as a dog, as easily as breathing, but our lives grow from meager soils and in ravines as barren as the boulders that litter their floors, difficult lands for meaning to take root. Meaning for us is a hard-won achievement, and one rarely attained, judged in terms of the meaning it contains. Shadow's life eclipses mine. It is this thought that motivates the pages to come. If this were merely a peculiarity of one or both of us, if Shadow's life were unusually meaningful or mine unusually meaningless, that would be interesting only as an oddity. But neither of us are outliers. As the general rule, I think dogs lead more meaningful lives than we do. working out why this is so indeed, why it must be so, is what this book is all about. So I think by picking up that paragraph, I've saved us a lot of explaining, except to say that your writing is very amusing and wonderful. And at the same time, when you get into philosophy, sounds like what you are, a real philosophy professor
Thank you.
sharing ideas. So I think it's the most unusual book I've recently read. I haven't seen philosophy, serious philosophy uh, paired with a serious examination of dogs, and that in turn paired with stories from your own life and relationship with your dogs. So there's a sort of three things going on here, and it really works well. It was a real pleasure to read. So anyway, I don't know where you want to take it from there, but that's the paragraph I chose to introduce the book.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Frank. I really appreciate it. Yeah, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great structuralist anthropologist, once said that animals are good to think. He said good to eat and good to think, but we'll just
Mm-hmm.
focus on the think bit. So animals as, useful tools for thought. So I sort of I learned from Shadow, and I've learned from all the other dogs
Mm.
that have been in my life through kind of osmosis. So in the current book, the sort of the impetus for the book was provided by daily walks
Mm.
that Shadow and I take, or used to take. He had a stroke a few months ago, actually, so he's
Yeah.
not really as mobile as he was. But we used to take these walks on the canal that runs behind the house here. And
Mm.
in the morning, there are scores and scores of iguanas that line the bank on our side of the canal, and Shadow will chase up and down and exile them to the other side. They'll jump in the canal, swim across, and stay over the other side for the rest of the day.
Mm.
But the at nighttime, apparently, this is when iguanas forget things. So in the morning, they'll be back again, and Shadow will begin his chasing. Or
Yeah.
so it struck me that this was kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was
Yeah.
a mortal who offended the gods. They made him roll a large rock up a hill.
Yeah.
When it gets to the top, it rolls back down. He has to start all over again.
Yeah.
And Sisyphus, in philosophical discussions of the meaning of life, Sisyphus features, pretty prominently, and he's taken uh, the significance of the myth is taken in two ways. First, it's the sort of the epitome of a meaningless existence, just
Mm-hmm.
repetitive activity that that aims only at its own continuation and
Yeah.
nothing. And secondly, it's taken as an allegory of human life.
Yeah.
The idea that we fight our way to work in the mornings, we do things with limited results, we fight our way home in the evenings, and we do this day in, day out. Any
Mm.
modest achievements we make will be washed away by time's remorseless passage.
Mm.
Um, and so perhaps we have children, and if so, they'll grow up and they'll do things that are, just notational variants basically on what we have done.
Yeah.
Pretty same sort of thing. And so Sisyphus is taken as an allegory of human life. And so the challenge posed by Sisyphus is that Sisyphus's life is meaningless, and
Mm.
our lives are recognizably Sisyphean.
Yeah.
And it was watching Shadow, every day doing the same thing. Uh, it just struck me this was probably the most meaningful part of his day.
Yeah.
Every morning he would have to start his task all over again. There's nothing that counts as success. He hardly ever catches them. They come back the next morning anyway. But
Mm.
it was probably the most meaningful part of his day. So this posed then to me a question. Well, how is it? What's the difference between us?
Mm.
Which that Sisyphus's life is meaningless. Sisyphus is taken as a representative human. His life is meaningless. But Shadow's life, which has the same overall structure and contours,
Mm.
is meaningful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well, you bring up an interesting point later in the book, and I've got a quote there, but I'll throw it in here to enlighten people who are listening to you. Um, you bring up a really good point that I discussed with my wife Jeannie at lunch. Actually, I was talking to her about how much I enjoyed the book, and I said, when you get toward the end of the book, Mark brings up this wonderful point where he says that one of the reasons dogs have better lives than ours is that we, as humans, are really two people, I don't want to oversimplify what you're saying, where the person who enjoys something, participates, loves someone, feels love, but because we also have this capacity of self-consideration and analyzing why we're doing this or feeling regret about something or second thoughts, we're never really wholly in the moment. And the way you finish the book, to really skip there, is to say that, with the mythology of Eden, the idea that we were thrown out of a garden where we once belonged, that sometimes you get an inkling of this because of how a dog is in the moment and really just one person living in that moment rather than considering the moment in the way that humans do, where we're really two people, we're the person in the moment, we're also the person considering that moment. So I just wanted to toss that in because I think that, it's a wonderful point you make, but it also has to do with the kind of Sisyphean dilemma we all face in doing the same thing again and again and again. And of course, the curse of that is we consider that. We're not in the moment. We consider the repetitiveness of. Whereas your dog goes out and just simply enjoys chasing the iguanas again and doesn't sit there saying, God damn it, I have to do this every day, or I'm compelled to do it. He's not considering that. He's just in the moment. I don't know if those ideas tie together or if I misrepresented what you're saying, but I just like the kind of the book, the bookends of those thoughts.
Right. Yeah, though that's my diagnosis of the difference basically between Shadow and Sisyphus.
Yeah.
There's something that happened to us a long time ago, and it's a kind of development in the nature of our consciousness.
Hmm.
It often goes by the word reflection. So
Yeah.
reflection is the ability to think about yourself, about what you're doing, and
Mm.
why you're doing it, and things like that. And
Hmm.
this capacity for reflection, if it exists at all in dogs, it exists in a very weak, attenuated form. But
Yeah.
we humans are the world heavyweight champions of reflection. We think about
Yeah.
it more than any other animal ever. Um, and what this does is you use the word moment, and I think that is significant. But it's more than that.
Mm.
It's that we're not really fully in our lives anymore.
Right. Right.
And there's the life that we live, and there's the life that we think about, we criticize, we scrutinize,
Mm.
we evaluate, we judge. And
Yeah.
because of this capacity of reflection, which makes this possible, we
Mm.
in a sense have two different lives. There's the life we live,
Yeah.
we think about, and so we're never fully immersed in either of those. Um,
Yeah.
in
Or we are, but in glimpses of it. I'm going to get to another point in your book here, but I can remember sometimes when you talk about considering the moment we're in, there have been times when I have lost myself in a moment. I mean, not the obvious ones of, a few minutes during sex or something. I'm talking about especially confrontation with beauty or even fear. And when you come out of that moment, say snorkeling in Bermuda once when I was just clinging to a rock on a reef,
Mhm.
looking at all these little baby parrotfish and sunfish and others swimming around, I got out of the water realizing that the water had been a little warmer than my own blood temperature. um, I had completely lost myself in the moment, and that itself seemed so significant to me that a couple minutes later, I was thinking, wow, for a minute, I actually was in the moment completely, and I sort of just disappeared in the sense you're talking about. I wasn't sitting there thinking, I'm having a good time, or should I be doing something else, or I wasn't even thinking, isn't this beautiful? I
Yeah.
literally was lost in that moment. And I've had a few experiences like that, which then when you crash back down into everything else again,
Mhm.
um, you spend a lot of time trying to get back to that or to find that again in something else. I guess it's
Yeah.
why we go to museums.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in those sorts of experiences, and it's not just the moment because it's extended over time. You're immersed in the world. The division between you and the world is broken down. I think
Right.
that kind of like the closest we can be to a dog chasing iguanas on a
Yeah.
canal.
With
Wow.
just pure joy. You
Yeah.
you 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 bring up earlier in the book, you say humans, Socrates tells us, can do this great thing with their lives, examine them. So great is this thing that without it, a human life is not worth living. But dogs never examine their lives. They can't. Given this juxtaposition, it is but a short step, and I know enough of Socrates to suspect it is a step he could not have resisted taking, to the idea that human lives are better than the lives of dogs. Human lives are better than the lives of dogs because we can and do examine our lives and they can't and don't examine theirs. We might grudgingly accept that their lives are worth living,
Mhm.
but they are not as good as ours. Today, this is an entirely orthodox view, one held, I think, by a sizable majority of humans. In the pages to follow, I am going to argue against it. Not only does examination make our lives no better than those of dogs, on balance, it probably makes them worse. And that's kind of, again, early in the book, I think in page 39 or 40 or so. So you're still kind of setting it all up. And then it follows from that. I have a question for you about the writing of this book. It seems to me you've had a relationship with the dogs you've had in your life for a long time. What stage of your life did that begin? Was it in childhood? And how did it gradually dawn on you that not only was there a book in this, but in making your observations about dogs, you were thinking things about dogs and the value of their lives long before you started thinking about writing about it. And I'm just wondering what that journey, what a little biography here of just your journey as a friend of your dogs and a relationship with them that has finally led to a book. How did that all unfold before we go further into the book?
Um, well, I suppose I have form for this. I, I I once when I was a young man acquired a well, he sold him as a wolf, but he was almost certainly a wolf dog mix, a wolf hybrid,
Yeah.
Brennan. And I acquired him when I lived in Alabama, and then we moved over to Ireland and over to England, and then finally France.
Mm.
Um, and a few years after he died, I just found myself sitting down one night. I was in France again, so I think the memories were sort of coming back.
Mm.
I just sat down one night and started writing about him for no other reason than I felt
Yeah.
like. And then, after a few days, a few nights of doing this, it just gradually I realized there was a book there. So it never
Yeah.
really occurred to me before that I could frame philosophical thoughts in terms of relationship I had
Mm.
with animals.
There's a bit in your book that really touched me because I've lost dogs as well who died on me.
Yeah.
Um, that story you tell about the dog that holds, I forget what you call it. It's like I call it the rag toy or whatever. It's that bit, the bite, the
The
thing that
bites.
it bites. What do you call it?
I'm not quite sure
In the
which.
book, you're talking about your dog who was in pain and at the same time finding
Oh, right.
joy in holding on to this toy.
Yeah. No, he loved that. He was a German Shepherd too. This dog's
Yeah.
name, and he was a very sweet, gentle dog, but he really did love biting a bite sleeve. So I'd have a bite sleeve on my
Yeah,
arm.
that was it. You called it a bite sleeve and he would bite that.
He
And
would, he
and
would,
I
he would
yeah,
shake me around like as a rag doll when he was young, but he got older and older, and in the end, he couldn't do it anymore. And so I just
right.
threw, and that was the thing he liked more than anything in the world, I think. And there was on the day of his death, he
Mm.
was still, trying to chase that sleeve around the
Yeah, and
garden.
he was in pain and dying, and yet he hadn't given up on this great central pleasure of his life.
Yeah, it was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. He was able to sort of hold death at bay, of only 10,
Mm.
just through through how much the force of his love for this
Yeah.
this and being human is great. We have lots of advantages, and everybody is happy to write about how great humans are. But this was a sort of polemical look at some of the things we probably lost because
Mm.
of these other
Yeah,
things.
and that kind of spontaneity of not just being in the moment, but really letting the moment speak for itself rather than trying to reflect on it. Um, and I love something just to jump ahead here, and I've got a quote that's nothing to do with this, but I really, really like where your book goes in so many areas where you talk about the fact that, the idea is that human intelligence in some way has changed or diminished since we learned to read and write, because before that, indigenous people, hunter-gatherer societies, where we've run into them, they can hold forth for 3 or 4 days, with one song or one story that they remember and pass down. And then after writing, we kind of forgot how to do that because it's in a book somewhere, so we don't have to remember as much. And then you talk about cell phones, but then you say dogs, have sort of done what we've done because I don't look at maps anymore. I let my cell phone direct me when I'm driving. And so I'm losing the skill to read a map, and I haven't taught my grandchildren to read maps. But that actually doesn't make us stupid because we're relying on this phone to do it. So in a way, we now have a piece of our brain that's outside of us. And then you bring a wonderful thing up that I just found so fascinating. You said the thing about dogs is that they use their humans to reason for them. So we know where the latch on the door is. We know where the food is. They trot around relying on us the way we rely on a smartphone to give us directions so we can get to downtown Boston and not lose our way and fight about it with our wife, as I used to do for years when I was reading maps. And I love that connection. The idea that okay, you lose something, um, but at the same time, dogs have learned somehow to use human brains to do whatever cognitive stuff they need to have done for them,
Yeah.
and in that sense, they have gotten into our lives and use us the way we use um, a smartphone. And I like that point. I mean, you made it better than that, but I just thought I'd let you go there because it's a really fun point. As in addition to everything else, I just loved it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in my other life, the life I lead as a philosophy professor, this is one of my hats. I was associated with this view in the philosophy of mind known as 4E cognition. So it's the idea that mental
Yeah.
activities are embodied, embedded, and acted and extended. So they spread out through the body into the world. They're not just confined
Hmm.
to what's going on inside your head. And so I mean, the fundamental sort of development in human thought came when we started inventing um, external systems of representation.
Yeah.
Written or some version of written language is the most obvious. So the ancient Peruvians, for example, had a system of quinus or knots where they
Hmm.
different types of knots to record certain types of information about taxes and the state of the army and so on and so on. So the idea is once you do that, the fundamental memory task that you face now changes. You don't have if you're a Peruvian Quinu officer who's been charged with conveying the message of his chief, for example, you don't have to
Hmm.
remember everything the chief says. You just have to remember the code that allows you to access the information
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
So the fundamental nature of intelligence changes. It changes from a sort of purely biological matter of wetware going on
Hmm.
to interactions between what's going on in here and what's going out there. So
Well, you use the example when you're introducing this subject of someone who knows they're going to be suffering increasingly from Alzheimer's and
yes,
cognition failure, and they start taking notes. So, I have to do this, I have to do that. You look at that, and of course, we all do that with our smartphones in another way.
yes, yeah, no, that's a very famous example from philosophers Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers, the case
Yeah,
of all. So he writes down information in a book, and they argue, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, they argue that the sentences in his book constitute at least some of his beliefs.
yeah.
The beliefs are not necessarily things stuck away inside your head. They can be out in the world in the form of written sentences.
Well, you talk about belief. You actually, it's weird that you brought that up because I have a quote here I love from page 83 that I'm going to talk about. Um, So you say we can revise, reject, or abandon our beliefs independently of anything the world does or does not do. And the belief section actually somehow gets involved with this idea of taking notes so you remember where you're going. So you believe in your note, even if you've forgotten what you were going to be doing.
Yes.
We don't need the world to educate our beliefs. We can do that ourselves. Our beliefs can die at our own hands rather than at the hands of the world. Reflection gives us the ability to murder our own beliefs. I love that sentence, by the way. It
Mhm.
means our beliefs are always in jeopardy. They
Mhm.
stand in peril of a critical scrutiny that is made possible by reflection. The specter of doubt has come to haunt all our beliefs, and it is our capacity for reflection that has summoned this specter. Of course, there may be many beliefs that a human never comes to reject, but it is not the actuality of rejection that is germane, but its possibility. The possibility of rejection is always there, quite independently of what transpires in the world. For a reflective creature, this possibility can never be rescinded. Our belief is, as Sartre once observed, always now troubled belief. I love that passage for a lot of reasons. One of them is because it sort of, you know, describes a lot of my own experience in terms of my journey. I'm 72 now, so a lot of sort of looking back at the journey and beliefs dropped along the wayside or whatever. But I also love that you use that to illustrate this capacity of memory, and then of course that ties in again with dogs and how they're different from us. So there was so much going on in that passage. I just zeroed in on it.
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking. I started thinking about that issue when I'd be walking shadow on the canal like, as usual,
Yeah.
and sometimes he would see iguanas and he would charge, but sometimes they weren't iguanas at all. They were just sort of
Mm.
palm tree fronds. If they're arranged, if they lie a certain way in the grass, they can sometimes look like the profile of a lizard holding its head up, and so on. So sometimes he will charge these palm tree fronds.
Hmm.
Um, and then when that happens and it doesn't run away, he realizes his mistake. So the world can change his beliefs,
Yeah.
but we're different. We have beliefs, and because we can reflect on them, we can think
Hmm.
about them and change them if we want to, irrespective of any input from the world.
Yeah.
So, um, so our beliefs are troubled in that sense. As
Yeah.
soon as we believe, we think, oh well, I believe this, but should I believe this? Do I have enough
Hmm.
evidence to believe this? What will others think of me if I believe this? And so on and so on. As
Well, and
soon,
not only that, you don't get into this issue, but one that is very apropos of our political moment right now is you can declare beliefs in something and not believe them, but they're useful to you. So
yes,
you
that's
can you
that's
can be J.D. Vance right now declaring that he believes Donald Trump when he says he didn't lose the last election. But we know J.D. Vance is not stupid. We know he doesn't believe that, yet he's saying that.
yeah,
And so that's even another way that belief gets used, or claims of belief. And then when we look inside, what are we really sincere about?
right, yeah,
So,
yeah.
I believe you've written a good book, but I'm saying that because I've got a podcast. And if I'm not interested in your book, then why are you on this? So there's something more about my belief system than simple sincerity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I suppose one way of putting it is that once you become aware of your beliefs, which you do through reflection, then the possibilities for doing things with beliefs
Mhm.
become endless. And the sort of things you describe, we can do those, we can do those too. And it's this basic separation between us and our beliefs, which is at the root of it all. So we're
Yeah,
separated.
let me just reintroduce you here a second. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Professor Mark Rowlands, and he is the chair of philosophy at a university. And Mark is the author of The Happiness of Dogs: Why the Unexamined Life is Most Worth Living. It'll be out in the States in January, called The Word of Dog, and we will get back and talk about it again because it's a wonderful book. Whether you're interested in philosophy, life, religion, spirituality, or dogs, or simply love a dog and want to understand how that animal fits in with your life, this book will just leave you breathlessly happy because it's beautifully written, but it's so interesting. Please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts if you want to help us out, keep this all going. And to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And now I just want to jump back to the book itself and read this, just to turn the page a bit here. Forget where this comes from. I think it's on page 90 or so. Uh, Thinking of reading Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, but can't be bothered with the 800 plus rather demanding pages? Here is a tip. Go to page 11 of Sartre's introduction, The Pursuit of Being, which is a synopsis of the book that is written in harrowingly abstract terms. On this page, you will find two sentences which provide a very nice summary of the entire book. I get the distinct feeling that after these two sentences, everything else is for Sartre simply a mopping up operation, a straightforward working out of their consequences. Here they are. Okay, here's the quote. All consciousness, as Husserl, if that's saying it right, I'll let you pronounce it correctly in a minute, as Husserl has shown, is consciousness of something. This means that there is no consciousness which is not a positing of a transcendent object, or if you prefer, that consciousness has no content. And then you go on a little later here and you say, a few pages after this, you say, the irony is, of course, that our entire lives are spent trying to build grounds for our actions. We are creatures of plans and schemes and machinations. We are the creatures that, more than anything else, try to bring a future into being out of our present efforts. Much of our life, much more than that of any other animal, is designed to bring one future out of many possible futures into being. And then you kind of go forward from there, and we get back into comparing that kind of human predilection for planning to dogs' spontaneity, but you bring it in by taking the sentences you need to read from Sartre's long book to kind of get what he's driving at. And again, I love these juxtapositions. I mean, really, really, just such a wonderful, set of ideas, but just terrific. And so, take the first bit about Sartre, and then tell me how to pronounce the other guy's name, and then go forward and link this all back up to dogs again.
Yeah, Husserl, as far as I know, Edmund Husserl. But yeah, Sartre, his major work was titled Being and Nothingness, and he
Right.
thought of reality as divided up into two different things. There's
Mm-hmm.
being. Being is anything you can be aware of, whether
Yeah.
you're aware of it or merely potentially aware of it. It's an actual or potential thing you can be aware of.
Yeah.
That's being. And nothingness, well, that's us. That's the awareness itself.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the implications, and it's an implication of that two sentence passage you read. Um, One of the implications of this is that anything you're aware of is not part of you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Something there for your awareness, and you can interpret it as you will. So he has a lovely example of a gambler who has resolved successfully for many
Yeah.
years to gamble anymore, and then as he sees the gaming table in front of him, feels his resolution just sort of melting away.
Yeah.
And Sartre's point is, well, once you're aware of this resolution that you've made, I will not gamble. That is my resolution. Once you're aware
Mm-hmm.
of this, then you are free to interpret it in any way you want.
Mm.
So is it still an absolutely binding prohibition that I must obey at all costs? Or is it the caprice of yesterday I can
Yeah.
now safely jettison? Um, those are two different interpretations, and nothing can compel you to make one interpretation over the other,
Yeah.
to interpretation of the other. So what this means is that none of our motives, none of our resolutions, or anything like that
Mm.
can can ever actually make us do a thing in the end.
Right.
I had a nice sort of illustration of this when I was running my first marathon, and it being my first marathon, I injured myself halfway through training, so I was severely undertrained. I got
Yeah.
to about the 16-mile mark, and I just kind of realized, well, all this unpleasantness that I'm going through, it can't actually make me stop, you know. Um, I'm
Yeah.
aware of this unpleasantness. I'm aware of it, and as such, I can interpret it any way I want. It can't actually make me do a thing.
Mm.
So that's the freedom characteristic of human beings, I think, which is the kind of freedom that's built up out of our ability
Yeah.
to the ability to be aware of our motives in one of
Mm-hmm.
its situations. So once we're aware of our motives, we can interpret them how we like. So nothing we decide, no motive we ever have, nothing we decide, nothing we choose can ever actually make us do a thing. So
Mm.
it's that's Sartre's conception of freedom as I read Sartre, and it's a very strange conception. It's sort of we're free to the extent that we're groundless. We're not grounded in
Mm.
anything. That we're not fixed in the world, or fixed to the world. We can. So it's a strange and in some ways terrifying conception of freedom, which I think is very different from the freedom of dogs, which
Yeah.
involves being according to their nature.
I think one of the unusual things about your book here, The Happiness of Dogs, which again will be published in the US in January, called The Word of Dog, and we'll talk about it again to make people catch up with this fact and see the book when it's out. But I think it's interesting how you have allowed the reality of dogs as we understand them. And you talk about the science of cognition when it comes to dogs. You talk about the testing. You quote people who, by the way, I've read because I'm interested in dogs as well. Um, and and I think you quote them very well in turn, but you do something different, and that is you hold dogs up, whether it's empathy or something else, as having a kind of a different kind of cognition lived out in the way they behave. And in a way, you test the veracity of the claims of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre with the behavior you see in dogs. And you don't do this in a specific way, but you basically say, no, I'm really questioning what Sartre is saying, whether this is true or not just from my own human experience, but because of what I've observed about dogs. And I think that's where your book goes somewhere that no one else has gone. I mean, all sorts of people have written on Sartre and questioned his views and compared it to other people. And all, you talk about positivism and all the rest of it, but the fact, and other philosophical trends. But I think what's really unusual about your book is you've kind of taken the prophetic role of dogs on Earth in terms of how they behave and do things and what they actually are as a kind of a rebuke to certain philosophical certainties, past certainties, whether it's Sartre or Aristotle, whoever it may be. Can you just talk about that aspect of your book and give me a few examples, unless I've gotten it all wrong? Because I really think that's what's unique about your book. I've never seen anybody compare Sartre's conclusions to what you have seen in the life of the dogs that you've been friends with, and say,
Mm.
no, in a way, the dogs have a better understanding of what life's about than Jean-Paul Sartre or Aristotle, for that matter. And this is really unique.
Right. Uh, yeah, no, for the record, I mean, I'm a big fan of Sartre. I don't know why that is. I just think he's right about a lot of things. I think he
Right.
had great intuitions. I'm not sure his construction of arguments left a bit to be desired, but I think his intuitions were spot on. So
Yeah.
what I think Sartre has, say, in his view of freedom, he's described human freedom very, very well.
Yeah. So maybe I've got it wrong, because what you're saying, though, is human freedom may be described well by Sartre, but you're saying there is another kind of freedom he's not describing.
Yeah.
And
So, and
that's what you've observed in dogs.
that's right. I think of the freedom of dogs. I think of Shadow just in full, exuberant mood, charging along the canal.
Right.
Um, it reminds me of the freedom as conceptualized by Spinoza,
Yeah.
where
Who you also, there's a whole section on Spinoza that I got some quotes pulled out of, but go there.
so I mean the part of I mean, the book is in a sense polemical, but the guiding idea is that actually one of the drawbacks of moving around the world a lot is I forget which parts of the world different phrases come from. Do
Hmm.
we use the phrase swings and roundabouts over here?
Yeah.
It's a swing and roundabout situation is where you gain certain things and you lose certain things. So
Yeah.
we
Right.
humans have gained various things through reflection.
Hmm.
We've also lost various things, and freedom is a great example. Our freedom, when you think about it, and I think really understand it, is truly terrifying. The
Hmm.
freedom of dogs is much nicer. It's the freedom of something that's rooted in the world, whereas
Yeah.
our freedom is the freedom of something which is essentially alienated from the world.
Yeah, you have an interesting section on Spinoza that I can go back to here, but I want to jump from where we are right now, freedom, to the issue of morality. And I think that one of the interesting things about your book is you talk about the fact that dogs are moral beings, and you talk about this. I'm going to quote something here. Receptive empathy, as I shall understand it, is emotional cognition where the other's emotion is not simply a cause of your emotion, it is also what your emotion is about. The distress of another, for example, is not simply the cause of your distress, it is what your distress is about. It is what philosophers call the intentional object, or the content of your distress. When this occurs, an inclination to help is automatically triggered precisely because you are concerned with their distress rather than with your own. That dogs exhibit receptive empathy, emotional cognition in which the other's distress is what their distress is about, can scarcely be doubted. And then a little further on, you say, crucial to this, excuse me, crucial to this qualifying as empathy is that the intruding dog engaged in helping behavior. And that relates to a story that you tell about a dog kind of haphazardly being involved in a project in which human children, are being studied for symptoms of autism, and then the kind of distress of the mother there, and a dog wanders into the situation, somehow reacts to it. So first of all, let's go to the point that I was making with the quote eventually, but first set that story up, because that's a fascinating story in your book about this kind of involvement of a dog, not haphazardly, but unintentionally by the researchers, the dog's reaction, the distress of the mother, the context, and then the actual point you're making that dogs have a moral sense that can be seen in their empathy, and that they are feeling your distress. It's such an interesting point, and I just like you to talk about it a little bit.
Right. Yeah. The experiments. There was a classic series of experiments conducted by Carol Zahn Waxler and colleagues. And the basic idea was if you have a sibling who's been diagnosed with autism, then this raises the chance of the younger
Yeah.
sibling being also autistic. So if you want to study the onset of autism or early autism in children, then you will look at those children with autistic siblings. So the standard protocol in these experiments involved the mother or caregiver pretending to be hurt. So, oh, I've got something in my eye, that kind of.
Hmm.
Then you see how the child reacts. Is it
Yeah.
does it try to help and so on and so on. So these experiments were quite often bombed, let's say, by the parents of the family dog who tried to comfort the mother who was pretending to be hurt. So
Because
if
she's testing to see what the reaction of the child is,
it's a
whether the
test for
child has a
empathy.
sense of empathy and connection.
Precisely. So exactly right. So if this is a test for empathy in children, then the dog seems to pass it. So it's difficult to see
Every
what.
time, right?
Yeah. Now I was reminded of this when I became a father for the first old time at the ripe old
Mm.
age of 44, and I was a little worried about how the new sort of house sharing arrangements were going to work because I had two dogs. One was a wolf hybrid, and the other was a German Shepherd Malamute mix, Nina and Tess. They were
Yeah.
Tess. Nina was the Malamute. And they were a bit old, they were a bit crotchety. They were formerly quite ferocious in their youth, or at least one of them was. But they doted on this new baby, this new addition.
Hmm.
They followed him around from room to room wherever he went. They were there, he crawled on them, he pulled their ears and so on. And they just
Yeah.
just shrugged this off with a sort of zen-like calm. And if he so much as squeaked in the middle of the night, then I'd have these two cold noses pressed up against my face almost instantaneously.
Yeah.
Wake up, father.
Wake up and do something.
Yeah, yeah. So working through that example, right? So my son makes a noise, a distress noise of some sort. He wants his diaper changed or something. The dogs become distressed. In turn, now that's known as emotional contagion, right?
Yeah.
The dog is distressed because the baby is distressed.
Yeah.
It was something more than that because what a dog can do if it's distressed is simply remove itself from the cause of the distress. Right?
Hmm.
So, oh, the baby's making a sound again. Let's go to the other side of the house, where it's
Right.
quiet. They didn't do that. They always solicited help from
Yeah.
me. Always left my wife alone for some reason. It was always me, so that's fine. And so what that seems to show, I think, is not simply that they were distressed because the baby was distressed, because you can deal
Hmm.
with that by vacating the immediate area, right?
Yeah. Sure.
We're also distressed that the baby was distressed. So the
Hmm.
distress was the object of their concern. So it's not simply a causal relation, as most people think of emotional contagion as one thing causing something else.
Yeah.
It's it's a distress that's about someone else's distress, and that's the basic roots of empathy, I think, in mammals.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that in the example you give, and these examples can be repeated in other people's stories, including just observing, the dog I have now, Zip, how he behaves when bad things happen to us, or he thinks they're bad. Uh, I think the point you make there that's so interesting is that Zip and this dog of yours, or dogs of yours, want me or whomever is able-bodied and around the adult in the situation, or the well person or whatever it is, to do something about it.
Mhm.
So it's quite the opposite of split taking off and ignoring the suffering. They're actually trying to summon help. Now
Yeah.
you interpret that as a kind of a moral action, but it's not a it's not thought out. So how do you define that in terms of morality in that situation, since this is not a decision in the same way we think of making decisions, but it's just that dogs are by nature empathetic, but also act on that empathy in a way that sadly a lot of humans don't. And I'm just interested in going a little further than maybe you do in your book, just how you think through these things, how you see that.
Right. There are different ways of thinking about moral behavior, and
Yeah.
the traditional way, and it's associated with philosophers like both Aristotle and Kant, who disagreed on pretty much everything else, but they both agreed
Hmm.
that in order to act morally, you have to be able to think about, critically
Hmm.
scrutinize your motivations or inclinations. So you have to be able to think things like this. I'm inclined to do this. Is this something I should do, or is this something I should resist?
Yeah.
So to be moral, you have to be able to do that. That's the traditional view of morality. But there's also a kind of countercurrent sort of view associated with the philosopher David Hume, which sees at the heart of morality is not that kind of critical reflection or scrutiny, but it's
Yeah.
based of empathy for others.
Mm.
And I think a lot of the time Hume is right, not just about dog behavior, but about human behavior. I mean,
Hmm.
I think the kind of critical scrutiny appealed to by Kant and Aristotle can often be a sign that something has gone wrong,
Yeah.
morally speaking. Um, Bernard Williams, I think, called it the one thought too many. So you oh, there's my son, he's in danger, about to be eaten by a snake, or bitten by a snake, or something like that. But there's another child there. Which one should I save? You start thinking
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
oh, you're already lost, morally speaking, you know?
Yeah.
Um, Whereas a dog just reacts, and it does so
Yeah.
on.
And but doesn't just react to the suffering. He reacts in a way that wants to solve the problem or do something, not run from it.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. I want to just quote something here apropos of this. I think this is from page 143, 44. Most of the time, we humans are moral in the way dogs are moral. There is very little in the way of critical scrutiny of our motivations in our moral behavior. Instead, our moral life is driven by emotions. These emotions are other directed, aimed at the welfare of others, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ones. The
mm,
urge to help and the urge to hurt are both moral emotions. We act on these emotions or we inhibit them, and out
yeah.
of these patterns of action and inhibition emerges the moral character of a person. I think that's a really good paragraph.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah. I think most of the time, Hume is more right about the mechanics of moral behavior than Kant and Aristotle. So if I'm at a junction on a highway and there's someone who's needs help, um,
Mm,
will I give them money? Will I not? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I mean, I could think to myself, well, shall I give them money? Maybe I could use the money for some better purpose or something like that. But I don't do that. Sometimes I feel sorry for them and give them money, and sometimes I don't. And it's emotion which is driving everything, not
yeah. And you have that you talk about this one person that you see sometimes at an intersection, and then one time he surprised you by saying, check out his latest piece of music on YouTube or
yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah, no, I was delighted by that actually.
I had a friend like that who I always gave money to when I was living on the Upper West Side in New York. Her name was Sheila, and she was, lived in a shelter for people who had mental difficulties. So fortunately, she was sort of uh, presented herself as homeless and kind of begged on the street, but she wasn't. And Sheila and I got to be good enough friends so that one time I just said, "Hey, Sheila, what are you doing with all this money?" And by this time, she knew me, and she says, "I'm buying lottery tickets, of course." She was, and then one time she saw me on TV, and in her shelter they had a common room, and I had been on one of the news programs. She followed me down the street, yelling behind me, "Frank Schaeffer has been on TV," like a scene out of one of the Woody Allen films, when you're stopped in the street. But anyway, I got to know her pretty well. Her name was Sheila, and she was terrific. But sometimes we assume things about people we call, homeless or unhoused, and actually they have real lives, and
Yeah,
they're not what you expect from time to time. Anyway, that's totally off the subject, but
yeah,
your story reminded me of Sheila. I hadn't thought about it for a while. For dogs, thinking, e.g., executing a logical inference is hard, but looking at a human face and working out what is going on in there, that's just automatic. All
Yeah.
the time they have spent with us has given them the ability to read us with extraordinary proficiency. Dogs even exhibit what's known as left gaze bias. This is a tendency to focus on the right side of human faces because the right side of the human face, being controlled by the left side of the brain, more accurately expresses underlying emotions. Humans do this to each other, particularly when strangers meet, and dogs have learned to do the same thing. I thought that was so interesting. And then you talked about some of the studies. So just take that little detour because it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's part of the idea of the extended mind that we talked about a little earlier, you know. So
Yeah.
if I'm having trouble remembering things, so I start writing things down in a book, then this becomes part of my extended memory. And
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have to be a book. I could make someone come around with me who would do all the remembering for me. The book is just one way of doing it. Having a person there to remember for me, that would be another way. We're
Mm-hmm.
like the things the dogs keep around to do all the remembering and other
Sure.
mem
We're useful to them. We're their smartphones.
yeah, where their smartphones, where their extended minds. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. And you kind of go, you follow the train of thought in another little quote here. The impact of of domestication on canine cognition is akin to the development of pen and paper on human cognition. We talked about this before. And just as important for them as that development was for us, humans are the external information bearing structures that dogs like to use. I love that they use us to solve the problems they encounter. It's much easier that way. A dog could execute disjunctive syllogism if he really wanted to, but why would he bother doing this when he has us around for this kind of thing? I love that. It's really it's entertaining and amusing, but just talk a little more about the science that's there because you reference these points with people's studies or how you've observed things and kind of present them as true. And I think they are. I mean, that certainly fits with what I've learned about the dogs I've had.
Yeah. Um, the the sort of traditional conception of the mind comes from the 17th century French philosopher and the father of modern philosophy, as he's often known, René Descartes, who thought that the mind was something located inside the head
Yeah,
somewhere. It's something that's shut off from the world. It's inside the skull. And and people who were materialists, people who believed the mind was a physical thing, they inherited the same basic picture, right? The mind is the brain. Well, the
yeah,
brain is shut away inside the skull. And but in the 1990s, there was a sort of reaction to this view that became known as the 4E cognition movement, which sees the mind as something that's not necessarily shut away inside the head. It's
mhm,
that extends out into the world, is
yeah,
distributed world. And so with things like smartphones, basically what are we doing? Well, as Andy Clark put it, we're making little bits of the world smart so
yeah,
so we don't have to be.
yeah,
I think there's a lot to that. I don't think it's quite right because I don't think it's we're talking about a reduction in intelligence. We're talking about a change in the nature of intelligence.
yeah,
And I don't think anyone will want to say that the advent of writing or external forms of represent information storage made us more stupid. Quite the
mhm,
contrary. But what it certainly did do was change the way our brains worked. Our brains now became broader. They incorporated things out in the world which we could use in solving cognitive tasks and puzzles.
yeah.
So I
You
think
talk. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, dogs fit that profile, I think, to a T, and
Hmm.
we're basically pen and paper for them.
Yeah. The difference being that dogs count on us, on humans being around enough, so there's always another human to help out. Whereas we're kind of more and more dependent on an electronic kind of world that, one power outage takes away. And then, where are we? We no longer know how to read maps and our cell phones aren't working. Now we're really fucked up. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of different. Whereas there's going to be a human around to help the dog figure it out. Um,
Hopefully. Yeah.
you say in this we find the perfect riposte. How do you say that? Riposte or riposte? How do you pronounce that?
I would say riposte.
Reposit? How do you say
Riposte.
it?
Riposte.
Yeah, riposte. So I just don't know whether your pronunciation, mine is the same, and I tend to stumble over some words here. In
Yeah.
this, we find the perfect riposte of Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes. For these exalted fathers of philosophy, ancient and modern, reason was the trait that demarcated us from and elevated us above the other animals. But Shadow has, that's a dog of yours, I think more accurately identified what reason is. Reason is just a tool, one among others, in a largest toolbox for getting you what you want. It doesn't matter where your reason is located. You might find it in your brain, you might find it in the worldly manipulation of information bearing structures, or, and this will be particularly true if you are a dog, you might find it in the brains of others. What is important is not where it is or even who has it, but that it is available to be used whenever and however you need it. Getting others to do your reasoning for you, to exercise rationality on your behalf, is ultimately a very rational thing to do. I love that because it is so true about dogs, but it's also true about my relationship with my wife, Jeannie, with whom I've been forever since we were teenagers. And she does all the taxes, she does all the strategic planning for, wills and legal documents and everything to do with that kind of work. And
Yeah.
then, I do most of the cooking. And this isn't some sort of post-feminist arrangement between enlightened people. This is just how it all fell out.
Yeah.
When you add up the two ways we function and what she's good at and I'm good at, we have a hell of a thing going because we're both really good at what we do in the relationship. I'm not saying they're not gray areas that
Yeah.
overlap, but they're very clearly demarcated. And I think, one of the reasons that we have a marriage that works and we're happy is because we actually don't interfere with the other person in their thing. I don't check up on whether she's doing her thing and she lets me do my thing. And then of course, now I'm looking at my dog differently because I read your book. And I really do see Zip looking at me hard, as you have a passage in your book about your dog just staring at you for 20 minutes because he wants to get in the car and go with you when you drop a kid off at school or pick up or walk or something.
Yeah.
Um, Zip definitely tells me exactly what part of the day we're in. And if
Mhm.
I've sort of let it slide and I forget, suddenly there's a tap or a look, and he is thinking about a specific. It's not general anxiety. He knows exactly what we should be doing at that moment of the day. Hey, it is past 8 o'clock and I haven't had my morning walk yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love that about your book, but I love that in terms of just the application of don't feel bad if you don't know how to do everything, as long as you know where to find the note to remind you to do that thing if you have Alzheimer's or the smartphone or your wife, Jeannie, because she really does understand the US tax code or whatever it may be. I love that. I love that in your book you go there. I just can't tell you. It tickled me deeply to read that about dogs.
Thank you. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah. So anyway, let me grab this other thing I want to read here. The life of a dog is much more like a voyage than a plan. I love this. Of course, the dog's understanding of the voyage destination may be hazy at best, but the same is true to a greater or lesser extent for us too. Having ceded most of his cognitive responsibilities to us, a dog does not plan, not much anyway. Any plans pertaining to his life will be drawn up by us. There are obvious drawbacks with this arrangement, but I think those are balanced by something else. What the dog has and what those who are addicted to planning have lost is a certain kind of spontaneity, together with the joy that accompanies it, that can only be found when there is no plan. I love that. These paragraphs are great. You've got to put them all somewhere just to let people understand how much fun it is reading this book.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, no, when I think about how my life would be if it had all gone to plan, it would
Yeah,
have been a nightmare. All the
yeah,
best things in life happened to me through improbable accidents.
yeah,
And the thing that happens when you're overly focused on the plan is you're not open to all these possibilities that
yeah,
life improbably throw at you. So
yeah.
I'm very, very happy that nothing went to plan, really.
Yeah, sometimes, I've had a journey of sort of believing in God and then stopping and moving away from Christianity and so forth. But sometimes I do tell people that one of the evidences for some sort of divine direction in my life is the serendipity of all my failures.
Hmm.
If Wired to Kill had made some money in Hollywood and I hadn't then been relegated to make shit movies, and then Jeannie said, "Why don't you write a book sometime?" I never would have written a novel.
Yeah.
In other words, it's never the quote successes. I mean, these are stupid words, but when I look back at 72 years of age and I find that I have some joy in my life,
Yeah.
half of that is because of the massive failures of my best laid plans to work out,
Yeah.
and where my ambition has run smack up into some reality like, hey, you don't have the talent to do this.
Yeah.
You're a mediocre whatever, or whatever it may be. um, I don't look back at a series of sort of triumphant stratagems that have succeeded. I look back at closed doors and then 10 years later, just so thankful
Yeah.
they got slammed in my face. And I think that's something of what you're talking about.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that's right. Uh, Most of the good things that have happened in my life were just accidents, and
Yeah, exactly.
but the thing about accidents is you have to be open and susceptible to them. You have to
Yeah.
react when they come along. You know.
Yeah,
It's
I feel this so much in terms of younger people. I sometimes see, have this big plan for success. They're going to need a master's degree to get this, or they're really interested in studying, medieval history, but that's not where the money is, so they change. They've got this plan, this idea what success is, and I do feel that sometimes the way you end your book, and I'm going to read a couple things here, the way you wrap it up on the subject of love is much more in tune with what I've experienced in my life, and also where I'm thankful that best laid plans did not happen for career success, for instance, because now, I have time with my grandchildren or whatever it may be,
yeah,
or with my dog Zip.
yeah,
You write, the lives of dogs are more meaningful than those of humans because there is more love in the lives of dogs. If you want to know what it is to love life, simply remember Hugo, with only moments of his life left to him, but magnificent still, his bite sleeve, which we talked about earlier, clamped tightly in his jaws, temporarily holding death at bay through the force of his love. I just tell you, that's a lovely, beautiful passage. And everything my own life has been best at experiencing or is truest to what I've seen is contained somehow in that little story. Because that's the whole thing, isn't it?
yeah. I think it is. Yeah,
You say, without uttering a word, my dogs tell me of a time before the fall, capitalize the fall. We're talking about the biblical fall from grace, the book of Genesis. And you're not writing as a Christian believer or theologically, you're talking about this, the fall. Through them, I remember a time before Reflections Canyon had opened within me, a time when I was one man and not two, when I had but one nature, one history, and one life, a life that I loved with one heart and one mind, undivided. I will never walk in the garden again. My exile is complete and irrevocable. Yet my dogs occasionally allow me to glimpse it, veiled, a distant shimmering on the bank, on the far bank of the Jordan. As I walk with my dogs in memory, I find myself gazing sometime towards Eden. It's a terrific way to wind your book up. I just love that. And I like this idea that somehow by over considering our lives, or by over ambition, or too many plans, or however we define success, that we sort of miss the point, and that dogs remind us, that love really is the point. I like what you say about that. I mean, I just can't tell you how refreshing that is.
thank you, thank you so much. Yeah, but the focus on plan is just one sort of manifestation of this capacity for reflection, because
Mm,
you're now reflecting on your life as a whole. Oh, this is where I want to be in 10 years. This is where I want to be in 20, and so on.
yeah,
And it's it's a way of, well, the story of the fall, as I understand it, is a story of the advent of reflection. You know, Adam and Eve,
yeah,
they as Milton puts it, they arise as from unrest, each the other viewing. They're finally aware of themselves for the first
mm,
time, and they're ashamed, and so on and so on. I think if there were such a thing as the Garden of Eden, then dogs would probably be a lot closer to it than we
yeah,
are, is my guess.
yeah. And you have this wonderful imagery of being cast out of the garden, and all of a sudden we're not at home anymore. The idea of security goes with it. And that's what you're reflecting on when this idea of being two people, the one that experiences the way a dog does, but then this one that reflects, but then diminishes the experience by over consideration.
Hmm.
And I often feel this when people fall in love. I have a godson who I won't talk about here, but he sometimes tells me about, how he's really in love with somebody, but, he's looking at his further studies or his career considerations, and they have these various aims, and I don't feel like yelling or preaching, but I tell him, look, if you're in love and she loves you and you guys have been living together for 5 years, what from my perspective as being a little older, fuck the job and the move. You're crazy. I mean,
Yeah,
you're talking about eating the wrapper and throwing away the candy. What the
yeah.
fuck does all this other bullshit have to do with where you want to wind up? And it's hard to know how to say that to a younger person.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder whether it's just because I'm old now, and the kind of pressure's off, because
Yeah,
if I fuck up, then I'll probably be dead before people really notice it
right.
anyway.
Figure it out.
The pressure is off. So I perhaps I just don't remember what the pressure was like when I was, 18, 20, 25, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's easier for us.
Yeah, I think the same thing. And, it's one of these things of trying to remember what it was like to be that age. The same with parenting a child. You get annoyed at something and you're saying, well, wait a minute, when I was 3, what was I doing? Or 12 or 10 or whatever it may be. So, yeah, you're absolutely right to take that kind of empathetic, sympathetic view. But it does seem in retrospect, looking back over my life with a lot less in front of me than behind me,
Yeah.
um, that the bits that I hold on to from my moment of Edenic connection, are literally the things that don't seem like a big deal. Go back in the realm of dogs. Zip sits in my bathrobe here while I write. He's all of 14 pounds. And after I've been typing for a while, he'll just look up and I'll feel that little nose, the thing you were talking about, press against me, or he'll start licking my hand, basically saying, hey, I'm still here. I don't know what all this other shit is you're doing, but
Right.
wouldn't it be time to exchange a kiss or two and a scratch and acknowledge each other?
Yeah.
He could, and that's literally his set of priorities. And then it brings me back down saying, hey, book schmuck, I've got this living little being right here. Okay, let's spend some time really looking at each other. And it like regrounds you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways,
Yeah.
Mark Rowlands, the book is The Happiness of Dogs. It's out in the UK. It's going to be published in the States called The Word of Dog. When it comes out, we'll put it in our book club and draw attention to it again, have you back on. And listen, when I sign off with you here, Mark, do me a favor. Don't you go away. Stick around for a minute and talk to Ernie, because we always ask our guests who comes to mind that we ought to interview that you know. It could be an author or a student or a friend who's working on similar things. And please say, hey, have you thought of this person? Or and if it's 1 degree of separation and you can put in a good word for us and help us get to that person, that would be great. But if you can come up with a name or two with Ernie when I leave here and just say, hey, if you're interested in talking about these things or related subjects or whatever,
Mhm.
pass a name or two on to us, would you?
Yeah, will do.
Yeah. And when the book comes out, we'll put it in our book club and we will link to it. So if there's anything you want to tell Ernie about the practicality of how to promote your book, which I think you said Harper, who's publishing it in the States?
Norton.
Norton's publishing it. So we can hook up to that and promote the word of the dog when it comes out under that
Yeah.
title in the States. So let us do what we can for you on that. And thank you for writing a really, really good book and just amusing and lovely and wonderful. And the philosophy's there, but you explain things well. It's not written by, I mean, I'm not a professor of philosophy and I understood everything you were writing about and loved it. So there you
Good.
go.
I think philosophy should be that way. I think if you can't explain it to anyone, then you don't really understand it.
Yeah. Well, you can explain it to anyone. You got some very lucky students. I hope they understand that they've fallen on their feet when they when you teach them, because you must be one hell of a professor.
Well, thank you. I don't know about that, but I'll ask them next time I
Tell
see
them if
them.
they give you any trouble to just talk to me. I'll tell them how lucky they are.
Thank you, Frank.
Hey, it's been great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.